good morning to all. Welcome to the second day of the Hemispheric Security Conference from Florida International University here in Miami. We have an exciting second day of discussions today on, as you know, one of the most important issues in the inter-American agenda, in the Americas agenda, security in all its different manifestations. Today, we have a program that includes a chat with Daniel Erikson, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere, to begin the day. Then we have a panel discussion on the future of the armed forces in Latin America, following by a panel discussion on the geopolitical convergence in Venezuela. So as you see, we have a busy schedule, a lot of interesting people, and lots of enthusiasm to approach this very central matter in our public policies. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our moderator for today, who will introduce our guest. He is Randy Pestana. Randy serves as Assistant Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives at the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. And he also belongs, obviously, because the center, his institute and my center are part of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. Randy manages the institute's partnerships with U.S. Departments of Commerce, Defense, and State. He's a good friend with a lot of experience in the field. Randy, the floor is yours to introduce our distinguished guest for the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, President Solis, and thank you to everyone in Zoom land, our friends from Latin America and the Caribbean. We do have interpretation, so if you need translation into Spanish or Portuguese, you can hit the interpretation tag at the bottom. I'm extremely humbled and excited to moderate this discussion with Dan Erikson. This was moderated by former DASD, Frank Mora, but I'm happy to try to fill his shoes the best that I can. So without much further ado, we're going to turn it over to Dan Erikson, where he's going to provide a little bit of remarks at the onset. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll take Q&A from the chat. For background, Daniel Erikson is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere at the U.S. Department of Defense. And in this capacity, he serves in the Office of Secretary of Defense and is responsible for U.S. defense and security policy for the 34-nation region that encompasses Canada, Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, and South America. And he previously served in the White House as a special advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden, where he covered foreign affairs and national security issues in the Americas. So with that, Dan, I turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Randy. It's great to be with you. Good morning, and good morning as well to President Solis. Always a pleasure to be engaged with FIU and this Hemispheric Security Conference, which I think over time has really become the place to come and discuss defense and security matters in the hemisphere. So I'm really very pleased to be here today. And I'm a little bit humbled as well, because I know we've got a great lineup coming on behind me, including my good friend, Admiral Craig Fowler, and Rocky Mead from Jamaica, and General Mejia as well from Colombia. And so I think it's going to be a great day. Last year, when I spoke at this conference, I talked a little bit about how the region was a strategic inflection point and how U.S. policies and U.S. defense policies really had to adapt to the changes that are taking place in the region as we had a series of new challenges and threats. And at this point, I really want to come back and reflect a little bit on what we've been working on the past year, how we see things lining up in the future, and how we've been implementing some of the interim national security strategy that President Biden outlined that describes the vital national interests of the United States as being inextricably bound to the fortunes of Latin America. Just to take it from the start, the Biden administration is very committed to U.S. policy towards the region that sees the region as being democratic, prosperous, middle class, and secure. And the U.S. Department of Defense is a key interagency player in this. We, of course, have many deep relationships across the region, from Canada to Mexico. And one of the things that I've been working on as well with the countries of South America, the Caribbean, Central America, is ensuring that we are really deepening our defense dialogue so that we are working together collectively on a whole range of issues, One of the first things I worked on when I came in a year ago was setting up the North American Defense Ministerial between Canada, Mexico, and of course my boss, Secretary Austin, to discuss North American issues. Beyond that, we've had dialogues with Brazil, with Chile, Argentina. Recently, I was in the Caribbean for the Caribbean Nation Security Conference, and had a number of ministers of defense and leaders up at the Pentagon as well. I think that over time, what we've seen is that the region is adapting to a new set of challenges, and therefore we also need to adapt. Of course, we've got the COVID-19 pandemic and the aftermath of those events, which affected economies and societies throughout the region. Also, really had a big impact on the armed forces. Create a situation where the armed forces had to take on new responsibilities and new roles, and the U.S. Department of Defense, while we're not the lead humanitarian agency, there are things that we can do to support our partners. There's also the whole transboundary challenge that's posed by climate change. Climate change is not traditionally thought of as a defense issue, but it does have defense impacts. Those, of course, include the need for humanitarian assistance and disaster response, but also more broadly, I think there's a number of environmental factors, environmental risks that need to be taken into account. At the department itself, we've been working on the National Defense Strategy that will provide clear guidance to the department in terms of how to defend the nation. Through our National Defense Strategy, Secretary Austin has directed us to align our priorities and our capabilities to address what we see as a changing and dynamic threat landscape globally. Part of this landscape, of course, includes the People's Republic of China, which the Secretary has identified as the pacing challenge of the department. But as we've seen, unfortunately, in the last few months with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, Russia does remain an acute defense challenge in Europe, but of course the impacts have been global. And then there are other threats as well, whether they're issues related to transnational crime, violent extremist organizations, and so forth. So as we look at this shifting global landscape, we really see that the capabilities that are required by the variety of countries in this hemisphere have changed, and where they really need to be much more empowered to act across multiple domains, not just sea, air, and land, but also in some cases space, and certainly cyber case as well. Our National Defense Strategy identifies 3 primary ways to advance our goals. These include integrated deterrence, campaigning, and actions that help to build enduring advantages. And within the department, my office has the responsibility for defense and security policy for the 34 nation region of the Western Hemisphere. We, the United States, of course, being the 35th member of this region. As I like to remind my colleagues, this is the only region of the world we actually live in. And so one of the key prisms through which we see our engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean is through homeland defense. We recognize that there is a deep-seated structural interdependence between the United States and our neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean. And therefore, when we engage in the region through campaigning or through other methods, it's important to synchronize operations, activities, investments that will strengthen deterrence and ensure that we in the United States, but also our partners in the region are safer. In terms of overall defense policy, we view the United States as having a significant advantage in the Western Hemisphere relative to some of our other strategic competitors. But we have to recognize that while this advantage is almost insurmountable, it requires continued sustained investment to be maintained. This is investment in the security capacities of our partners, investment in the relationship, investment in interoperability, so that our capacity to work as a collective retains all of its abilities and indeed gets stronger over time. One item, which I mentioned briefly earlier, that has been of great interest to Secretary Austin is the concept of integrated deterrence. I'll let the interpreters kind of struggle with that for a minute. But the integrated deterrence is the concept where DoD doesn't stand apart, but instead is supporting broader government efforts, including efforts within the U.S. interagency, but also working with our allies and partners and neighbors to improve their capabilities. And I can't underscore enough the importance to partners and allies to how the United States engages with Latin America. President Biden has said in the past that it's not what we in the United States do for Latin America, but it's what we do with Latin America that matters. And we really very much believe that at DoD. We recognize that while partners may bring different things to the table, different capabilities, some strengths and some weaknesses, that there's really no such thing as an unimportant partner. Every partner is important, and it's important for us to sit down, listen to them, take seriously what their concerns are and what their needs are, even as we develop our own engagement. So in terms of implementing the National Defense Strategy, there's a few steps that we've been taking. One is really to focus on deepening defense and security partnerships in the Western Hemisphere. I alluded to several of these early on. And I think it's been really great at DoD that we've managed to maintain a very strong up-tempo of engagement, key leader engagements, even during the COVID environment. I think that I certainly in the past had an opportunity to travel through the region with Admiral Fowler and more recently with General Richardson. Now that the Pentagon's opening a little bit back up again too, I've brought in a series of leaders for meetings, but I think that focusing on those relationships is really key. That's a key strategic advantage and something that's very important that we maintain. I also have been focused on ensuring that DoD's support role in Central America and the Caribbean remains strengthened. With a lot of the U.S. engagement with Central America and the Caribbean, of course, it's other parts of the interagency that in some ways have the leadership role, whether that's the State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, it might be Treasury or Commerce or others. But I think that DoD also has a very important role to play. And what we've seen in the Caribbean and Central America is a great deal of receptivity to that, interest in figuring out ways to work with us. Not everything is an apples to apples situation. Sometimes it's apples to oranges. Not every country in the Caribbean necessarily has a defense force. It might be more of a civilian police type of engagement, but there's still ideas and concepts that we can share and ways that we can work together. And just in the past several months, Southcom convened a Central America Security Conference. I referenced the Caribbean Nation Security Conference. And so I think that's been totally critical. And then looking forward, we want to prioritize institutional capacity building, work with countries on humanitarian assistance and disaster response, and also ensuring really effective use of security cooperation, that we have some resources, but they're not unlimited. It's really important for us to engage in smart ways with the countries. And we've been very fortunate to be able to do that. I think looking forward as well, I've seen a lot of ways for us to engage with some of the bigger countries in the region. Brazil, while it's not always necessarily straight sailing on the diplomatic side of the house, on the defense side, the relationship has been quite strong. I've had the opportunity to go to Brazil several times since taking this position, and I think that's something that's been very useful. Colombia, of course, is one of our deepest and most important defense relations in the hemisphere. And it's one where I think that there's a lot of opportunity to build on the work that's been done so far, which I very much look forward to. And I know that in recent days, there's been a lot of talk and discussion of the Summit of the Americas, very exciting. all of it. But we're also looking forward to the Conference of Defense Ministers of the Americas, which is a once every 2-year defense ministerial that this year will be hosted by Brazil. And I think that will be a great opportunity for us to talk about a number of themes, including integrated deterrence, how we can work more together on strengthening the military and defense ties between our countries, the challenges posed by transboundary threats of all natures, and of course, how we should be dealing with our strategic competitors in the region. And then I would just say, looking ahead, I recognize that right now we are in a particularly interesting moment in Latin America and with U.S. Latin American relations. I think that there's a lot of political trends in the region that bear watching. I know we've got a number of very important elections that are coming up later this year in the region. And one of my real watchword on the defense side of the house is resilience. I think it's extremely important for the United States to build resilient defense relationships with the countries of Latin America that are capable of moving forward and advancing shared priorities, even as you have different political swings in different countries, or as priorities may shift a little bit from time to time. At the end of the day, the United States shares so much more in common with the region than we do have in differences. And I think ensuring that we have that resilience, and the resilience is really built on the relationships, is totally key. So with that, Randy, those are just a few opening thoughts for you. Again, I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the remarks. One thing that really stood out to me was your comments on focusing on relationships, right? And one thing I noticed, last year when you were at the HSC, you were a few months in. Now you've got a little over a year under your belt. There seems to be kind of an increased effort by the Biden administration to really strengthen and build or grow those North American relations, especially more recently, the bilateral support with Canada of Ukraine regarding the Russian aggression there. Can you talk about some of the work you've done in strengthening that North American relationship since you started your post, and why was this such a priority?
Absolutely. So North America has been key for us from the get-go. I think that at the very beginning, President Biden prioritized North America. You may remember that he had very early engagements with Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada and President López Obrador. There was a North American summit as well. And on our side of the house, on the defense side, we engaged through the North American Defense Ministerial, which is a once every 2-year meeting between the U.S. Secretary of Defense, his counterpart in Canada, and then the Mexican Secretary of Defense and Mexican Secretary of the Navy. And I think that there's a lot of good work that's been done there in terms of sharing visions of how we see the continental threat assessment, working together to ensure that we've got strong information exchanges. There's work to see what more we can do in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster response as well. And all of that's been really important. But beyond the kind of North American construct, Canada is a very special relationship for the United States. Within this hemisphere, it's the country that's the member of the G7. Besides us, it joins us as being part of NATO. And so in the year plus that I've been at DoD, there's been a very constant tempo of engagement with Canada, not just on hemispheric issues, but on global issues. And I was very pleased to be with Secretary Austin a couple of weeks ago when he hosted the Canadian Minister of Defense, Anita Anand, for her first visit at the Pentagon, where we discussed a range of issues, whether that's the Russian aggression in Ukraine. We shared ideas about how to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. Of course, the U.S.-Canada bilateral defense relationship, North American aerospace defense modernization, and a range of other topics. Interestingly, Canada is also very taken with seeing what more we can do to collaborate in the Arctic. And so there was an Arctic ministerial, virtual Arctic ministerial that Canada convened just earlier this week, where the department participated. And I think that there's more that we can potentially do north as well as south.
Fantastic. Now, you recently mentioned this as part of your remarks that you attended the annual Caribbean Nations Security Conference. Much to certainly my dismay, the Caribbean is often overlooked by a lot of scholars that follow and study the region. Can you discuss some of the key takeaways from your discussions with the partners in the regions, and what were some of the notable security concerns faced by the Caribbean nations?
Sure, absolutely. This was really a great opportunity. I was able to travel with General Richardson to Barbados, which hosted the conference, Prime Minister Mia Mottley and her security team. And it was really a convening of not just the English-speaking Caribbean, but the Dominican Republic participated as well, as did a few other observer states from Latin America. And there were a number of things discussed. I mean, I think that from the perspective of the Caribbean, of course, natural disaster response and resilience is of extreme importance. Climate change and climate defense and the pressures those put on security forces and armed forces as well. Haiti and how to manage the ongoing situation in Haiti was an issue of concern. And what I heard a lot about as well from the Caribbean partners is just the need for domain awareness, especially maritime domain awareness, so that they would have just a better sense of what types of vessels or illicit traffic is really moving through the Caribbean. And so I think that's a very important point to focus on as well. And so I think we do have a lot of opportunity on the Caribbean. I do try to keep an eye on it, and I'm lucky to have many good friends in the Caribbean that help me make sure that I'm up to speed on some of the challenges. And one of them is actually on the panel right after mine, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead, who we were able to host at the Pentagon back in January. And so I think that this is something that we're remaining very engaged with.
I want to pull on the string a little bit with regard to your comments of climate change, obviously being extremely important. That's been a key pillar of the Biden administration's focus, not just in the region, but globally. Fewer places are more impacted than Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Whether it be extreme weather patterns, environmental considerations driving migration from Central America, increased environmental degradation through illegal mining and illegal unreported, unreported fishing. What is DoD specifically kind of doing in this space to support partner nations prepare for those risks, build that resiliency, as you mentioned, associated with climate change?
So Secretary Austin has asked us as a department to really look seriously at what we can do on climate in a number of different ways. A part of it is really internal, looking at how climate's going to affect DoD's own operations, our energy resilience, our installations. But then there's a second component, which is around partner engagement. And what we found is that every country in its own way is dealing with climate or environmental impacts. And there's a lot of similarities across that, but also each one has many have different approaches. You have countries where really the issue is drought, deforestation, others where they're affected by powerful storms, cases that are you've got flooding or other things as well. And so from our perspective, it's really about building up, I think, a shared understanding of how climate, which really is not traditionally thought of as a defense issue, impacts the defense institutions. And we think about this in the U.S. as well, but certainly certainly abroad. And really, I think lessons learned from the region is very interesting as well. I mean, Colombia is doing a lot of work to prevent deforestation and exploitation of the national parks in Colombia. Guatemala as well has had the military engaged in environmental issues. So one thing I've seen is once you kind of peel back a couple of layers, you found partner militaries who really don't kind of or haven't traditionally thought of themselves as engaging in climate-related activity, but in fact who have been in some ways. And I think getting those lessons out of the region will be extremely helpful. And then it also just aids in interoperability in other areas. So whether it's the fight against transnational organized crime, whether it's building up sufficient capabilities that we could use for peacekeeping or other types of activities, that there's really a spillover effect where engaging on climate also has benefits that we see in other areas.
That's great. I want to turn to a question. It's related to one in the chat from Chris Woody. And this is really regarding, the supposed competition between, the US and China in the region. And he's asking in terms of, does China's inroads in Latin America kind of serve as a risk to US? But I want to ask, what is DoD really doing to make the U.S. the partner of choice within the region vis-a-vis China?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. There's a lot of interest about China's activities in the region, and to what degree U.S. Interests are affected or influenced there. China, of course, is very active economically in a number of countries. The level of defense cooperation between China and the countries in Latin America is far less, but it does exist. And the overall trend line has been going up. And then, of course, you have China's political engagement as well. From the Department of Defense side of the equation, what we really try to do is work closely with countries in the region to determine what are their capabilities. Are there areas where the United States can be more proactive, either through security cooperation, training and exercises, work on cyber and cyber defense, for example, to ensure that we are and remain the most valued and trusted partner of the region. And I think right now, in fact, we're quite, on the defense side, we're quite well positioned on that front. Particularly when you compare it to the economic side of the equation, where there's just a certain level of economic complementarity between China and some of the countries of South America, where they are just going to be exporting more of their goods to China than the United States. Like that's not, and that has to do with the the economic structure of our country and what we need to import for our own economy, which is different in many cases from what China requires. But I think it requires maintaining that kind of, as I mentioned, this constant tempo of engagements, of really sitting down with our partners in the region, figuring out what their needs are, and seeing what it is that we're able to provide or help them to gain the skills or the tools themselves. And a constant refrain at the department is outcompete. How can we outcompete all of our strategic competitors in this area of the world, and something that we remain very, very focused on. And as the overall security dynamic in the relationship evolves, what we need to do to outcompete evolves as well. And that's something that we're working very hard to stay on top of.
Thanks for that. One of the things you mentioned, obviously China is really engaged in this space, is the cyberspace, the information technology space. One of the most recent events, and it's still ongoing, is the ransomware attack in Costa Rica, essentially shutting down parts of the government services. This is one of those areas that I think integrated deterrence really kind of plays, where DoD is playing a role, and then you have other partners from across USG. What is kind of the role that DoD has done in kind of supporting partners? Is it through training? Is it through technology transfers, information sharing? What are some of those things, particularly in the cyberspace, that you can discuss about DoD's role?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, cyber has really become a very critical element of our engagements with all of our key partners in the region. When I meet with counterparts from the ministries of defense, whether it's from Central America, the larger countries in South America, Mexico, cyber and cyber defense, and really comparing notes on how we see the threat landscape and figuring out how we can work together more deeply is really critical. Some of what can be offered is through training, sharing best practices, sharing what we in the United States are doing for our own cyber defense, and seeing what lessons might be learned or be relevant for countries in the region. We do, in specific cases, do also have teams that are able to go out and work directly in a more hands-on way with a partner country. But it's case by case, and even within the U.S. government, while DoD has a big role in cyber defense, there's the Department of Homeland Security, there's law enforcement agencies that share that responsibility with the United States, and that's true in Latin America as well. As Costa Rica, has no military, while they do have a Minister of Defense, and so it's when this particular attack struck in Costa Rica, they had their own domestic agencies working on it, and then did reach out for assistance, and some of our domestic agencies got involved as well to help that. So it's really in some ways, a case-by-case basis. And of course, there's work that we do through our training and institutes. There's a lot of cyber work that's done at the Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, which is a DoD regional center based in Washington. And but this is something that we're seeing as being really critical to we as the department maintaining this position as being a trusted partner of the countries of the Western Hemisphere.
Fantastic. I think one of those areas that I really, this concept is with regard to COVID relief response report support of partners. I recall, I think you were in Honduras with the newly elected president, Xiomara Castro, where I think DoD delivered, I think it was 18 freezers, right, to be able to store COVID vaccines. What are we still doing in the COVID relief and support space in the region from a DoD perspective?
Yeah, COVID relief has been really, really important. And there's, of course, there's the whole component of vaccine and vaccine distribution, and the White House has led a major effort on that in terms of getting vaccines out to countries. But then there's all the supporting material, whether it's the ultra cold freezers that are needed to maintain some of these vaccines in cold storage so they last longer. Of course, personal protective equipment, field hospitals that have been donated through our humanitarian assistance program, and also kind of sharing some lessons in terms of how COVID actually has impacted our own force readiness in the United States, and some of the steps that we've taken to manage through that process, and sharing some of those lessons with our neighbors. And so I think that COVID, it's a classic case where no one was really thinking before that pandemics would be a core defense mission, right? And in some ways, it's still not, because it's really the civilian health agencies that are principally responsible for managing this. But the defense institutions and the militaries did play a big role in a variety of these countries, and also their own soldiers and officials were impacted by COVID, so affected force readiness throughout the region. So we do maintain strong engagement on the humanitarian side through COVID support. Thank you for mentioning the donation of the freezers. It was a really important and long-awaited event in Honduras, and there have been a number of other examples throughout the region of engaging in that way. And while we're in, I think, a better shape now on COVID, as we know, and as this conference demonstrates, since we're doing at least part of it virtually, and I remember the days when this was a big in-person event, we're still managing the impacts of this pandemic. Hopefully we're mostly on the other side of it. But I think that moving forward, we're going to have to stay very much on top of this topic. And let's be frank, this isn't going to be the last pandemic either, right? And so the lessons that we can draw out of the COVID experience will hopefully be useful for everyone moving forward.
Thanks, Dan. I want to turn to a question from the audience. I think it's really important. This is from David Murado. He asks, given the period of austerity and DoD spending, can you comment or provide an opinion on the importance of human security efforts and efforts like women in peace and security? Examples of this can be increasing women's meaningful participation in the military in Latin America and examining gender as part of planning considerations. Can you comment on that?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm really glad it was raised. That's something that we've been very active on, and I've been really pleased to see that General Laura Richardson, the current Southcom commander, has also really picked up that theme and moved to advance it in terms of her engagements with the region. I think that women, peace, and security is an area where Latin America and the Caribbean really has a lot to demonstrate. Some countries are further ahead than others, but you've got, I think, a lot of really good stories and good examples on this issue of achieving greater gender parity in the militaries and in the armed forces, or if not gender parity, at least gender presence, where you have women who are coming in and beginning to reach some of the more senior ranks in a variety of countries. In fact, the successor to Lieutenant General Rocky Meade in Jamaica is the first female chief of defense in the Caribbean. And so that's a really interesting kind of glass ceiling that's been broken in the Caribbean on this issue as well. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a major conference on women, peace, and security in Chile. Members of my office went down to support it and to follow up on some of those activities. The Biden administration as a whole, the White House has put out a major document about a little less than a year ago on women, peace, and security and how we're going to move this forward as an administration. So I think it's a really critical theme, and it's one that it's been really, frankly, pretty exciting to work on since I've been at DoD.
Thanks for that. We have another question here from Roberto Lopez, and this is really with regard to the relationship with Mexico. I know earlier we talked pretty deeply in terms of the Canada relationship, but how has that Mexico relationship, particularly in the security cooperation space, been?
Sure. So the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the defense relationship has been very good. We have I mentioned the North American Defense Ministerial, but we also have a separate forum, the U.S.-Mexico Defense Bilateral Working Group, which is chaired by the Undersecretary of Defense at DoD with his counterparts in Mexico, which takes place about once a year. We had one last spring, and there will be another one coming up relatively soon. And this provides a great opportunity for the U.S. and Mexico to share assessments on how we see the challenges, look at the overall continental threat issues, seeing what bottlenecks there may be to cooperation or collaboration, and also plot a way forward on things, whether it's cyber or HADR or other things. There's also, and that's just on the DoD side, there's also a whole U.S. government interagency piece where there's a bicentennial framework that has been advanced by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Homeland Security and their Mexican counterparts that looks more at the public security piece of it, and some of the work that can be done in terms of combating transnational criminal organizations and the cartels. And so that piece exists more, I would say, in the civilian agency lane than the straight up DoD lane. But that has been an important piece of progress that we've seen as well. General Van Herk, who's the commander for U.S. Northern Command, just hosted his counterparts from Mexico up in Colorado about a month ago. And so that was a really meaningful engagement. And so in general, I would say that the quality of the U.S.-Mexico defense relationship has been very positive.
Thank you for that. We do have a question here from Marcus Montiero asking, and I'll broaden out the question. It's asking what role can the Inter-American Defense Board contribute? I would broaden that out to ask what kind of support or what kind of return are we getting from the support from organizations like the Inter-American Defense Board, from the Perry Centers, U.S. Army War Colleges, and other, IMET type institutions from the U.S. towards the region?
Sure. Well, all of the ones you named, they all work in a similar space, but they're all, slightly different. I mean, I would say, with respect to the Inter-American Defense Board, I've had an opportunity to get to know Admiral Rubeo, who's the current chair of the board. He's a Brazilian admiral. To really listen to him and hear what his vision is. Within our structure, the Inter-American Defense Board is really an activity of the Joint Staff and of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so while I engage with them on the policy side, I work really hand in hand with my military counterparts when it comes to the board. But they've been, I think, a very good partner. They've done a lot of work in terms of looking at coordination mechanisms for disaster response and how the militaries in the region can work together on that. And they also played a really helpful role recently when I had a Guatemalan delegation up for the U.S.-Guatemala Defense Bilateral Working Group, and the board hosted us. And so we actually held our defense meeting at the headquarters of the Inter-American Defense Board, Casa del Soldado, for those of you who know it. And the board gave us a great presentation on this. I also had the opportunity a few weeks ago to bring the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, into the Pentagon. It was his first ever visit to the Pentagon. And we had a really great discussion about broader regional affairs, the role of the OAS in defense and security issues, but also about the board, which was very helpful. So I think that the board is something that has been playing a critical role. And then, Randy, with respect to some of the other items you raised, the Perry Center and a few of the others, I think that we have been getting a very strong return on investment from these types of educational exchanges and regional study centers. A lot of times when you engage with countries in the region that and they talk about their needs, they'll focus on the capabilities and they'll focus on the hardware, right? More helicopters or near coastal patrol vessels or radars. And the hardware is important, but there's also the software, right? Which is how are we operating together? How are we working together? How are we thinking through some of these important elements? And I think that training and capacity building of the human element and of the human side of defense cooperation is really where we have a key advantage.
Fantastic. I want to go to an area that I know you're extremely familiar with. You've worked on this quite a bit. Is really Central America, and more specifically the Northern Triangle. You have a lot of dynamics there, but Honduras traditionally has always been one of the strongest military-to-military relationships we've had. How has been working with the newly elected Honduran president Xiomara Castro and their team following the elections last year?
So so far it's been very good. I mean, they haven't been in office too long. I think the inauguration was only in January, and it's May now. But there's been a very strong tempo of engagement. I was fortunate to be able to go down there in February. As you may recall, Vice President Kamala Harris was actually the head of the delegation to the presidential inauguration, which took place in January. I was there a month later with General Richardson, had an opportunity to meet with President Xiomara Castro and members of her team, and including the Minister of Defense, Zelaya. And I think that there's a real willingness to engage and try to move forward on a number of fronts. We did have positive relations with the prior Minister of Defense and with the Honduran military, but the overall political relationship had really, shall we say, a chill had kind of set in due to some of the allegations related to the former president, and which now are openly in the news. And so there are reasons for that. And so I think that this does provide a little bit of an opportunity for a reset with Honduras. Honduras also hosts U.S. forces there at the Sotocano Air Base. And so that's a key element of the engagement as well. And then more broadly in Central America, that we have really been interested in maintaining, at least an open dialogue with all of these countries on perhaps -1, Nicaragua, on military and defense issues, to at least ensure that we have, some basic understanding of how things can move forward, or when things aren't moving forward, to explain why things aren't moving forward. There's a lot of concerns, as I'm sure you're aware, about the need for the countries in the Northern Triangle to uphold the highest levels of transparency, maintain strong positions against corruption and so forth. And that's a message that I very much reinforce in my own engagements with the ministries of defense on those issues, because I think with Central America being such a focus of this administration in the region, that we all really need to make sure that we're adhering to the best possible standards, and that's a point I make every time I engage with Central American counterparts.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to something that came out earlier this year, which was the Unclassified 2022 National Defense Strategy. At least the fact sheet came out. I know the classified version was delivered to Congress. But one of the key themes, and again, this is more broad for DoD, but it's related to the aggression coming from the PRC challenge, talking about defending the homeland and multi-domain threat by the PRC. And we have a question in the chat regarding, the increased presence of China, particularly in ports and infrastructure projects in the region. Can you talk or elaborate a little bit in terms of how the defense strategy is supporting kind of efforts or pushing more efforts into protecting against the Chinese threat?
Sure, absolutely. The Secretary has identified China as a pacing challenge, as a key strategic competitor. A lot of that, of course, focuses on the Indo-Pacific region, but we recognize that the challenge is not just in that region, but also global. Africa is part of that discussion. Latin America and the Caribbean is part of that discussion. And so, the first thing is to really identify what are the key issues and key challenges, and make sure that we are sharing that point of view with our partners in the region. Now, we understand that not every partner in the region shares our view of China. And often, when we see something as potentially challenging or potentially adversarial, some countries, basically agree with us, but there are others that say, no, this is just a trade relationship and we want to be good friends with everybody and so forth. And so I think really ensuring that we're able to share more information with countries where we have serious concerns is really important. I think also being able to have a level of analysis and fidelity where you can kind of separate out, what is a strategic investment from China that's detrimental to U.S. interests in Latin America and potentially detrimental to the interests of our Latin American partners, from just Chinese investments that may not have a strategic implication. They may add up to, increase the bottom line of China's investment or of what China's buying or selling, but it's more commercial in nature versus being something that has a true defense equity. And that seems like it should be really easy to figure out, but sometimes it's pretty complex. And sometimes the things that look really worrisome, you look into them and it's not that much to worry about, and things that look relatively benign have a bit of a undercurrent there that requires more investigation. And so it is something that we're very focused on. We don't want to be alarmist, but we do want to be realists and also very, I think, precise and analytic in terms of figuring out what is and what is not a potential threat to a partner country or to U.S. interests. And that's why, kind of looping back a little bit to the conversation on Central America, that's why it's so important that we work with these countries in the region to uphold the highest levels of transparency, anti-corruption, a level playing field for investments, because I think that there's a potential risk there if you have countries where there's kind of deals that are taking place that aren't subject to public review or procurement, or don't go through normal pathways. And it might create opportunities for other strategic competitors in the region.
Yeah. So we have another question in the chat, and this is really regarding, DoD efforts supporting civilian insecurity and other larger efforts in the Andean region. So looking at Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. 4 very different countries. I'll just start with Colombia, because for us, Colombia is really foundational. It's a key partner, one where we've really developed a lot of capacity and capability and interoperability over 2 decades. And I think that, it's pretty widely recognized that Plan Colombia and its evolution over time has been among the United States' most successful foreign policies in the region. And so with Colombia, I've traveled there more than any other country since I've taken this position, hosted numerous Colombians in my office and elsewhere at the department. And for us, it really is a key country. President Biden likes to refer to Colombia as the keystone to the region, and I agree with that assessment. And recognize that coming up, Colombia does face elections. We'll see. The polls, are different every day, so we'll see how it turns out. But why I really focus on the term resilience and ensuring that we have a resilient defense relationship that can not just survive but thrive, even as there are different political twists and turns in the countries. Next one I'll move to is Ecuador. So really have had great interactions with Ecuador since coming into this position. I've been meaning to travel down there. Events have taken me away each time I planned a trip. So hopefully I'll find a moment to make this possible. But President Lasso has been very forward-leaning in terms of wanting a stronger defense relationship with the United States. Last winter, we sent down some advisors to Ecuador to help them look at their overall national security management, national security process. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think over the coming period, you'll see the United States leaning in more to engagement with Ecuador. Peru also has been traditionally a very strong partner for us. Now the new government, the Castillo government, has had a lot of turnover in senior positions. And so while I think the overall baseline for the defense relationship is strong, I would like to see more connectivity at the leadership level there than we've managed to have so far. And then, so we'll take those 3 as a set. And then moving over to Venezuela, obviously, the situation in Venezuela has been very concerning for some time. We see a lot of engagement by external actors in Venezuela that worry us quite a bit. And DoD remains supportive all of the overall interagency agenda and the objective of ensuring that Venezuela is able to move towards free, fair, and open elections.
Thank you for that. We have another question in the chat, and this is really regarding the role of the armed forces. As you already know, the armed forces is perceived favorably in most countries across the hemisphere, arguably the number 1 or 2 more positively received institutions in each state, minus a couple. There's an increased demand in terms of having the military play in these kind of domestic security roles and other non-traditional security roles, if you will. So what do you think, what are you seeing, what are you visualizing in terms of U.S. engagement with the militaries now that they're kind of broadening their scope of work in terms of security?
Well, there's a few points I'd make on this. One, just to echo something that Secretary Austin said during the Southcom change of command ceremony last year, that, it's extremely important for democracies in the region to ensure that the militaries are abiding by their constitutions and supporting their democratically elected leaders. And so, one message that we keep up is militaries, should be primarily engaged, of course, in military and defense missions, but they really need to be very respectful of their civilian democratically elected authorities. Now, beyond that, there is a lot of pressure in a variety of countries for the armed forces to take on roles that are better left to civilian authorities, whether that's border management, internal kind of law enforcement, policing types of issues as well. And there have been a number of cases of countries that have really drawn on the military to provide some backstop to the civilian law enforcement when the civilian law enforcement faces challenges that they're just not able to manage. We hope that when that happens, that it's done in accordance with the rule of law, that it's temporary. We do not favor any kind of long-term military engagement in civilian law enforcement in countries in Latin America, and that and from our side, the military to military relationship is really at its best when we're able to work together on traditional defense objectives. And so we, when we work with partner militaries in the region, do so on issues primarily related to defense, rather than some of these other internal issues.
Thank you for that. We have way too many questions that we're not going to get to, so I'll end on this one. We have a busy year ahead of us before the 8th annual Hemispheric Security Conference. So if we want to give kind of that DoD preview, you know, what are the few things that are really noteworthy in terms of the U.S. Latin American relation over the next year that we should be on the lookout or anticipate?
Well, you know, it's a big hemisphere. Yeah. There's a lot happening across the board. Just a few things I would highlight. I think you're going to continue to see a lot of progress in the U.S.-Canadian relationship as we work towards modernization of North American aerospace defense, and as we deepen collaboration with Canada on a range of issues related to NATO, and look at Canada's global role. I think that turning to the Caribbean and Central America, that we are going to remain very engaged on a variety of factors, but also really looking a little bit more at climate and what can we do around climate-related defense issues that would be of help to that region. Not this year, but next year, there will be the next round of the North American Defense Ministerial with our partners from both Canada and Mexico. When we're looking at more we can do in terms of humanitarian assistance in Central America. And then turning to South America, we're kind of at the beginning or maybe in the middle of an election super cycle, as we had the elections in Chile recently, of course, Colombia and Brazil coming up, Argentina not too long after that. And from my side of the interagency, we're really and I'm very focused on ensuring that we have strong, resilient defense relationships, one where we have a positive agenda, that we're moving forward together, and ensuring that we do continue to remain the most valued partner of our neighbors in Latin America and the Caribbean.
And Dan, in true DoD fashion, we're ending right on the dot. So thank you again for your participation. Appreciate your support and hope to keep you engaged in further discussions on security in the hemisphere. With that, President Solis, I turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Randy. It was a great moderation. And thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere, Dan Erikson. Thank you so much for your remarks. As usual, it was a great pleasure seeing you, and we thank you for coming to this conference.